The night my son changed the locks, the temperature was 12 degrees below zero. I stood outside the home I had lived in for 41 years, in my robe and slippers, watching the lights glow warm through windows that no longer recognized me. My own son had done this. The boy I carried, raised, protected, and loved without conditions had just handed me a death sentence wrapped in paperwork, and he was celebrating inside. But here's what Grant Vance never understood. You cannot steal what you were never meant to own. Stay with me. This story is just beginning. If this speaks to you, hit like, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm had been building since noon. I remember watching it from the library window that afternoon. Thick gray clouds rolling over the mountain ridge like something ancient and slow-moving and inevitable. The kind of sky that makes you pull a blanket tighter and be grateful for walls and warmth and the particular comfort of a place that is yours. The Vance estate had been mine for 41 years. Not Grant's, not Marissa's. Mine. My late husband, Harold, had built the main house himself, not with his own hands, of course. Harold was not that kind of man. But with his vision, his taste, his insistence on limestone fireplaces and 10-foot ceilings and windows that caught the light in a specific way every morning that made you feel, even on your worst days, like the world was still worth being present in. He had loved that house with the same quiet ferocity he used to love me. Steadily. Without announcement, as if it were simply the natural order of things. Harold had been gone for 6 years. And for 6 years, I had managed fine. Better than fine, honestly, though I would never have said that out loud to Grant, because Grant had a particular sensitivity about not being needed. He had always wanted to be the one doing the managing. Even as a boy, he would rearrange things. His bedroom furniture, his school schedule, his younger cousins during holidays, with the air of someone who believed order only counted if he was the one creating it. I had loved that about him once. I had found it charming, the way a mother finds things charming when she is still too close to them to see what they actually are. That afternoon, I was sitting in the library with a cup of tea that had gone cold, reviewing some correspondence from the Vance Family Foundation, a literacy program Harold had started in the 1980s that still operated out of 3 counties. I had been its chair for the past 2 decades. It was not glamorous work. It was spreadsheets and grant applications and the occasional school visit where children would sit on gymnasium floors and look up at you with the kind of open, wondering attention that made every tedious budget meeting worthwhile. The letter I was reading was from a school principal in a small district 2 hours north. She was thanking the foundation for a program that had helped 14 of her students learn to read at grade level. 14 children who had been slipping through the cracks. I was thinking about those 14 children when Grant walked in. He did not knock. He had stopped knocking around his 40th birthday, as if proximity to 50 had relieved him of basic courtesies. He walked in with his coat still on and his cheeks red from the cold outside, and the particular set to his jaw that I had learned over decades to be wary of. "Mother," he said. Just that. The way a person announces the start of a difficult conversation. I folded the letter carefully and set it on the desk. "Grant, I didn't know you were coming today." I texted. "I don't always see the texts right away." A pause. "Would you like tea? I can have Rosa." "I don't want tea." He pulled a chair from the corner and sat down across from me with the posture of a man who has rehearsed this moment and is now slightly impatient to begin it. "I need to talk to you about some things." "All right." "The estate, the accounts, the foundation." He said each word with a brief, deliberate pause between them, as if he were reading from a list, which, I would later learn, he was. "What about them?" He leaned forward. "Mom, I've been looking over everything since Dad died, and honestly, I'm concerned. There are inefficiencies everywhere. The estate costs are out of control. The foundation is hemorrhaging money on programs that don't generate any return. The hotels are not meant to generate return in the way you're describing," I said. "They're part of a long-term, I know what they're part of," he said, and the air quotes were in his voice, even though his hands stayed still. "I know what Dad intended, but Dad has been gone for 6 years and the world has changed, and I think it's time we had an honest conversation about who is best positioned to manage these assets going forward." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and felt something shift in the room. Not dramatically, not like a door slamming, more like the almost imperceptible moment when a floorboard begins to give way beneath your weight. So subtle you almost convince yourself you imagined it. I manage these assets, Grant. For now. He said it quietly, careful. But you're 68, and after Dad, after everything, he made a gesture with his hand, a gesture that was meant to imply fragility, confusion, the general unreliability of an aging mind. I had seen him use it before in other contexts, describing elderly neighbors, an older colleague at his firm. It had never been pointed at me before. I felt the heat of it, the particular humiliation of being gestured at like a problem. I'm 68, I said, keeping my voice level. I am also the chair of a foundation that serves 3 counties, the trustee of a family trust that has been active for 40 years, and the owner of this house. I manage these things adequately, Grant. That's the thing, though. He shifted in the chair. The trust. I've been talking to some advisors, financial advisors, some legal people, and they've raised some questions about the current structure, about your capacity to... my capacity. The word landed between us like something thrown. He had the grace to flinch slightly. It's not an attack. It's just, you're alone up here. You're managing all of this by yourself, and Dad's been gone 6 years. I'm your son. I'm trying to help. And there it was. The sentence that predators always use. I'm trying to help. I should have ended the conversation there. I know that now. I should have called Miles Brenner that same evening and said, Grant is asking questions about my capacity and the trust structure, and I want you to be aware. But I did not, because he was my son, and a part of me, a stubborn, foolish, permanent part, still believed that the child you raised could not truly mean you harm, could not look you in the face and plan something cold. That night, I thought he was overreaching. I did not yet understand that he had already begun. Quote, the next 3 weeks happened quietly, the way a tide comes in. Grant called often, friendly calls mostly, asking about my health, asking about the foundation, asking small logistical questions that seemed innocent individually, but which I would later understand were reconnaissance. He was mapping the territory, learning which accounts I accessed regularly, which staff members I trusted, which lawyers I consulted, which neighbors I spoke to. Marissa called once, which was unusual. Marissa did not call unless Grant had asked her to. She was warm in the way of a person performing warmth, all smooth voice and careful sentences, asking if I had been sleeping, asking if I had thought about coming to stay with them for a while, just to rest. The estate must be so much to manage alone, she said. Grant worries. Tell Grant I'm fine, I said. There was a small pause. Of course, she said. Of course you are. But something in the pause stayed with me. Then, 2 weeks before the night of the storm, things changed. Rosa came to me one morning with an expression that told me she had spent the night deciding whether to speak. Rosa had been the estate's housekeeper for 18 years. She had worked for Harold when he was alive, had brought me soup during the bad months after his death, had never once overstepped or underspoken. She was the kind of person whose judgment I trusted completely. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her hands folded in front of her and said, Mrs. Vance, Grant called the house yesterday when you were out. About what? He asked me questions about your schedule. What time you go out, what time you come home, when you have appointments. She paused. He asked if I thought you were, his word, managing. I set down my coffee mug. What did you tell him? I told him you were managing fine. Her jaw tightened slightly. He didn't seem satisfied with that. I thanked her. I told her she had done the right thing by telling me, and then I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she left, looking at the cold garden through the window, turning the word managing over in my mind like a stone with something underneath it. 2 days later, I could no longer access the secondary household account. This was the account I used for estate expenses, staff, maintenance, utilities, the small operational costs of keeping a large property running. I had used it without interruption for over a decade. When I tried to access it online, the system told me my credentials were no longer valid. I called the bank. After 40 minutes on hold, a representative told me the account had been restructured under a new authorized user. When I asked who the authorized user was, there was a long pause, and then the representative said carefully, "I'm afraid I can only discuss account details with the authorized parties, ma'am." I hung up the phone. I sat very still. The authorized party was my son. I should tell you something about the kind of anger I felt in that moment, because I do not want you to imagine it was dramatic. It was not. It was not the hot, rushing anger of a sudden betrayal. It was something older and colder and heavier than that. It was the anger of a woman who has spent her entire adult life being underestimated by boardrooms, by investors, by a culture that looks at a woman of a certain age and sees a figure to be managed rather than a force to be reckoned with, and who has learned, out of necessity, to carry that anger quietly. I did not call Grant that day. I called Miles Brenner. Miles was Harold's attorney. More accurately, he was the attorney Harold had trusted with everything that mattered. The trust structure, the estate documents, the 40 years of careful planning that Harold had done to ensure that the Vance legacy would outlast him without becoming a war between the people he loved. Miles was 73, slightly deaf in one ear, and possessed of the kind of calm that came not from detachment, but from having seen every variety of human behavior and made peace with the full range of it. "Eleanor," he said when he heard my voice. "Miles, I think Grant has accessed the household account without my authorization." A brief pause. Then, "Tell me what happened." I told him. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always valued about Miles. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor, I want you to do something for me. Do not confront Grant about this yet, and do not sign anything. Not a document, not a form, not an email authorization that comes from him or from anyone he sends to you. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Good. I'm going to make some calls." I did not hear back from Miles for 4 days, which, under normal circumstances, would not have worried me. Miles worked at his own pace and had always produced results on his own timeline. But these were not normal circumstances, and the 4 days were not ordinary days. They were the 4 days in which Grant moved. Later, I would piece together the sequence from bank records, emails, and the testimonies of people who had witnessed pieces of what happened. During those 4 days, Grant contacted the estate's financial management firm and told them that I had experienced a health event and was temporarily unable to manage the accounts. He produced a document, later determined to be forged, purporting to give him emergency financial authority. He accessed 2 more accounts. He contacted the car service that maintained the estate vehicle and terminated the arrangement, telling them the car was being sold. He contacted 3 members of the household staff and informed them that management was transitioning and they should direct all property-related questions to him going forward. He told Philip, the groundskeeper who had worked the estate for 22 years, that his services were no longer needed. Philip was 64 years old and had worked that land since my oldest rosebed was planted. He called me, shaking with something between disbelief and fury, and I told him, because I still believed even then that I could handle this through ordinary means, that there had been a misunderstanding and I would correct it. And then came the night of the storm. I want you to understand how ordinary it began. I had spent the afternoon on the phone with Miles's assistant, gathering documents that Miles had requested. The storm had moved in harder than forecast, and by early evening the wind was pressing against the library windows with enough force to rattle them in their frames. I was thinking about making dinner, something warm, something simple, when I heard the sound of tires on the gravel drive. 2 cars, headlights sweeping across the ceiling of the front hall. I walked to the window and looked out. Grant's car. And behind it, a vehicle I did not recognize, a dark SUV with what I would later understand were rental plates. The front door opened before I could reach it. Grant came in with 2 men I did not know, both in dark coats, both carrying briefcases with the air of people who had been briefed on a situation and were present in a professional rather than a personal capacity. Behind them, Marissa, in a camel-colored coat, her face arranged in an expression of practiced concern. "Grant?" I said. "What is this?" "Mom." He didn't look at me directly. He was looking at the room, scanning it really, as if he were already calculating what would stay and what would go. We need to talk. You brought people into my home without telling me. Our advisors. He said it smoothly. This is necessary. What is necessary? Grant, look at me. I stepped into his line of sight deliberately, forcing the eye contact. Look at me and tell me what is happening. He looked at me then, and what I saw in his face was something I had not seen before, or perhaps had seen and refused to name. It was not cruelty exactly. It was something more bureaucratic than cruelty. He had made a decision, and the decision had been made, and he was now in the phase that came after decisions, which was implementation. I was an obstacle in the implementation phase. Not a mother, an obstacle. We've engaged some estate management specialists, he said. They're going to take a look at everything. The accounts, the property management, the foundation operations. Just an assessment. You do not have the authority to bring... Mom. His voice sharpened slightly. You've been struggling since Dad died. Everyone can see it. I'm your son. It's my job to protect you. One of the men with the briefcases was already moving toward the library. Something ignited in my chest that I had kept banked for weeks. Stop! My voice came out different, lower, with something in it that made the man actually stop and turn. You do not go into that room. Grant moved between us. Mom, you need to calm down. I am calm. What you are doing is illegal, Grant. You have used a forged document to access my accounts. You have terminated staff without my authorization. You have entered my home with people I have not invited. I want you to leave. All of you, right now. A silence. And then Grant said the words that I will carry for the rest of my life. I've already talked to a doctor and a judge and Mom. He pulled an envelope from his inside jacket pocket. The locks are being changed tomorrow. The accounts are already frozen. And I think it would be better for everyone if you spent the next few weeks somewhere else. I stared at the envelope in his hand. Where else? I asked. My voice came from somewhere very distant. We can talk about options. Where else, Grant? He exhaled. There are some good facilities. Clean, professional. You want to put me in a facility? It was not a question. The words came out with a kind of terrible clarity, the way things do when you have finally understood something you had been refusing to see. You want to take my home, my accounts, everything your father built, and put me somewhere I can't get in the way. I want to help you. Get out of my house. Mom, get out. Yeah. I do not remember the next 40 minutes in any clean, linear way. I remember voices. Grant's, Marissa's, one of the advisors saying something about authorization and documentation and provisional control. I remember Rosa appearing in the hallway and me telling her to call Miles Brenner immediately, and then one of Grant's men saying something to Rosa, and Rosa going very still and looking at me with an expression that broke something inside me. I remember Grant, at some point, saying to Marissa in the voice people use when they think you cannot hear them, "She'll understand once she's had time to settle. This is what's best." As if I were a misbehaving child being sent to her room, as if I were nothing. At some point, I believe it was near 9 o'clock, though I cannot be certain, Grant produced a key. Not his key. A new key. He held it up with the kind of deliberateness that was its own form of violence. "The locks are already done," he said. "I told you. The company came this afternoon." I walked to the front door and tried my key. It did not turn. I tried it twice. 3 times. With the absurd persistence of someone who believes that a physical reality might change if you engage with it forcefully enough. The storm was fully on us by then. The wind was something alive and hostile. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees below zero. I was wearing the clothes I had dressed in that morning. Slacks, a cashmere sweater, indoor shoes. I had not eaten dinner. Grant stood in the hallway of my house, behind a door that no longer recognized me, and said, "I'll have someone come get you in the morning, once you've had a night to clear your head." And then he closed the door. I stood on the front step of the home I had lived in for 41 years, and I listened to the lock engage, and I felt the cold move through me like something geological. Slow, certain, absolute. I did not scream. I want you to understand that. Not because I was too proud, though pride was part of it. Not because I was too shocked, though I was shocked in the way of someone who knows, intellectually, that a thing is coming and is still unprepared for the weight of it when it arrives. I did not scream because screaming would have been the response Grant expected, and I had decided, in that moment on the step with the wind cutting through my sweater and the lights glowing warm and mocking through the windows, that I was done giving Grant what he expected. I had one thing he did not know about. I had one thing he had never read, never asked about, never thought to verify, because Grant Vance had always been a man who assumed that possession was the same as ownership, and that the loudest voice in a room was the one that had already won. He had lived his entire life on that assumption. He was about to discover what it costs. I pulled my cardigan tight around my shoulders, turned away from the house, and walked into the snow. And I kept my secret. The walk to Ruth Calloway's Inn was 2 miles. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 2 miles. In 12 below zero temperatures, in indoor shoes that were never built for snow, in a cashmere sweater that the wind cut through like it was tissue paper. 2 miles down a mountain road that I had driven 100 times but never once walked in winter, in the dark, with ice forming in the tire tracks and the storm pressing against me from the north like something with a personal grievance. I had no phone. Grant's people had taken it from the kitchen counter while I was arguing with him in the hallway. I had not even noticed until I was already outside. I had no wallet, no coat, no sense of where exactly I was going beyond the single, stubborn knowledge that Ruth Calloway's Inn sat at the bottom of the mountain road and that Ruth had been my friend for 31 years and would not turn me away. So I walked. I will not dress it up for you. It was not a noble walk. It was not the determined stride of a woman who has found her resolve and is marching toward her destiny. It was a cold, miserable, humiliating shuffle through gathering snow, and there were moments, more than I would like to admit, when I thought about sitting down. Just for a minute. Just to rest my feet, which had gone from painfully cold to numb somewhere around the first half mile. And numbness, as anyone who has experienced genuine cold knows, is not relief. It is the warning that comes before something worse. I thought about Harold during that walk. That surprised me. Not because I don't think about Harold. I think about him every day, in the small ways that grief eventually settles into after enough years, the way you reach for someone in a habit so old it precedes thought. But I thought about him specifically, clearly, with the kind of sharp recall that cold and shock sometimes produce. I thought about the year we had almost lost the first hotel. 1987. Grant was 11. We had overextended on a renovation, the market had shifted, and for about 6 months we were genuinely, seriously in trouble. I remember Harold sitting at the kitchen table late one night with papers spread everywhere, and I had brought him coffee, and he had looked up at me and said something I had never forgotten. The thing about a real crisis, Eleanor, is that it shows you exactly what you're made of. Not what you think you're made of, what you actually are. He had survived that crisis. We had survived it together. I was trying very hard in the snow to remember what I was actually made of. By the time the lights of the Calloway Inn came into view, warm amber squares in the darkness, a painted wooden sign swinging in the wind, I could no longer feel my feet at all. My fingers had locked into a shape that was not quite a fist. My hair was wet against my neck. I was shaking in the specific way that the body shakes when it is no longer performing distress, but simply responding to it at a cellular level, involuntarily and without drama. I pushed open the inn door. The bell above it rang. The warmth of the interior hit me so suddenly that my eyes watered. Wood fire from the far corner. The smell of something cooking. And Ruth Calloway herself, 67 years old, built like a woman who had refused every single comfortable compromise life had offered her, coming out from behind the small check-in counter with an expression that moved through surprise and confusion and landed, very quickly, on alarm. Eleanor. She crossed the room in 5 strides. Her hands caught my arms. Eleanor, what in the name of— I need to sit down, I said. My voice came out wrong. Thin. Far away. You need a great deal more than that. She steered me to the chair closest to the fire and began pulling at my wet sweater with the no-nonsense efficiency of a woman who had raised 4 children and dealt with emergencies without consulting anyone's feelings about it. Thomas, she called toward the back. Thomas, bring the blue blanket and the soup from the pot and do it right now. Ruth, don't you dare tell me you're fine. You are the color of old paper and you're shaking hard enough to rattle your teeth. Sit there. She pressed me firmly into the chair. Sit there and don't move. I sat. Thomas, her youngest son who helped run the inn in winter, appeared from the back with a blanket that he wrapped around my shoulders without asking any questions, bless him. And Ruth disappeared into the kitchen and came back 90 seconds later with a bowl of soup that had clearly been on the stove for hours and tasted, in that moment, like the most important thing I had ever put in my body. I ate, I warmed, I stopped shaking eventually. And Ruth sat across from me in the other fireside chair, watching me with the patience of someone who has waited out many things and knows that everything surfaces eventually. When I finally set the bowl down, she said quietly, "Tell me." So I did. I told her all of it. From Grant's visit to the library weeks ago, through the account access and the staff dismissals, to the night, this night, and the men with briefcases and the new key and the closed door. I did not cry while I told it, which surprised me. I had expected to cry. Instead, I felt the particular terrible clarity that sometimes follows a shock that is too large for ordinary emotion, a kind of compressed, exhausted precision, like the world had been reduced to only the facts that mattered. Ruth listened to everything without interrupting once. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the fire. Then she said, "That boy." 2 words. She put 40 years of restrained opinion into them. "I need to reach Miles Brenner," I said. "I need to call him tonight. It's nearly 11. "I know." I looked at her. "I still need to call him." Ruth handed me her phone. "Okay." Miles answered on the 4th ring with the slightly gravel-edged voice of a man who had been awake but resting, and when he heard mine, he sat up. I could hear the shift of it, and said, "Eleanor, where are you?" "Ruth Calloway's in. Grant changed the locks." I said it the way you report weather, matter of fact, because if I said it any other way, I was not sure what would come out instead. A silence, though, then, carefully, "Are you safe? Are you physically all right?" "I walked 2 miles in the snow in indoor shoes, Miles, but yes, I'm physically all right." Another silence. Longer this time, and I understood that Miles was doing what Miles always did in moments of genuine seriousness. He was setting aside every reaction that would not be useful and organizing very quickly and very methodically, the ones that would. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Eleanor, listen to me. What Grant has done tonight, the locks, the accounts, removing you from the property, this is not just a family dispute. What he has described is criminal elder exploitation, and it is a direct trigger under the trust document. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Tell me more specifically." "Harold's trust has a protection clause. I never thought we would need it, honestly, because Harold never imagined." He stopped, reorganized. "The clause states that if the designated successor engages in exploitation, coercion, abandonment, or fraudulent action against the living trustee, the successor is automatically disqualified. The operative word is automatically. Grant cannot inherit control of that trust. And Eleanor, he cannot take it. It requires your active, voluntary, uncoerced approval to transfer, which you have not given, which you will not give." I closed my eyes. I had known this, in the abstract way that you know things that your husband's lawyers explain to you during estate planning sessions and that you hope you will never need to actually use. But hearing Miles say it, in this moment, with the fire snapping behind me and Ruth watching me from across the room, hearing it stated so plainly and so firmly. "So everything he's doing," I started. "Is legally worthless," Miles said. "The account access was fraudulent. The document he used was forged. I've already had someone look at it. The staff dismissals, the lock change, none of it holds. He cannot sell the estate. He cannot liquidate the trust assets. He cannot do any of the things he's told his investors he can do." There was a pause in which I processed this. "He's told investors," I said slowly, "that he can do these things. He's been raising capital for that luxury development project for nearly 8 months, Eleanor. He's told at least a dozen investors that the Vance estate and hotel assets would serve as collateral. He needed you out of the way to make that work. Without trust control, he has nothing to offer them. The fire popped. Somewhere outside, the storm pushed against the walls of the inn. "Miles," I said, "how long have you known this?" A pause that was fractionally too long. "I've had suspicions for about 2 months. I started making inquiries when you first called me about the account. I didn't want to alarm you until I had something concrete." I thought about the 4 days I had waited while he made calls. I thought about Grant moving through those same 4 days like a man who believed time was on his side. "All right," I said. "What do I do now?" "Now," Miles said, "you stay exactly where you are. You do not contact Grant. You do not respond to anything he sends you. And tomorrow morning, you and I meet in my office, and we begin the process of making sure he understands exactly what he has done." I handed Ruth back her phone. She had been pretending to look at something across the room to give me the illusion of privacy, which was a kindness, because there was no actual privacy in a room that small. "Well," she said, "I'm staying here, if that's all right." Ruth stood up, picked up the soup bowl, and said over her shoulder, "I'll put you in the corner room. It has the best radiator." She paused at the kitchen doorway. "And Eleanor, that boy had better have a very good lawyer, because you're going to need to borrow mine." I did not sleep well that night. I want to be honest about that. There's a narrative available to me in which I lay down in Ruth's corner room and felt some transformative clarity and rose in the morning renewed, purposeful, armored. But the truth is messier than that. I lay in the corner room listening to the storm and thinking about Grant as a boy. About a specific afternoon, he was maybe 7, 8, when he had fallen from the oak tree at the back of the property and broken his wrist. I had heard him cry from inside the house, and I had run out with my heart in my throat, and he had been sitting at the base of the tree, not crying anymore actually, just holding his wrist against his chest and looking at it with a kind of concentrated curiosity, as if it were something happening to someone else. "Does it hurt?" I had asked. "Yes," he said, "but I'm figuring it out." I had loved him so fiercely in that moment, that small, stubborn boy, figuring it out. I lay in Ruth's corner room, and I thought about that boy. And then I thought about the man who had stood in my hallway with a new key and said, "I think it would be better for everyone if you spent the next few weeks somewhere else." And I tried to find the thread that connected them, the unbroken line between the child I had raised and the person who had left me in the snow. I could not find it. Not that night. Maybe not ever. Grief and anger are not opposites. You can hold them both. I lay in that room and held them both, and eventually, somewhere past 3 in the morning, I slept. By the time I woke, the storm had passed. The mountain was clean and white and brutally bright, the way it gets after a heavy snowfall when the sun comes back and bounces off every surface without mercy. I could hear Ruth moving around downstairs, the particular rhythm of someone who has been up for hours and has already formed strong opinions about the day. I borrowed clothes from Ruth, a heavy sweater, wool socks, boots that were half a size too large but serviceable. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. Gray hair, slightly disordered, eyes that were a little hollow, 68 years old, wearing borrowed clothes in a borrowed room, starting over. I looked at myself and said quietly to my own reflection, "Do not feel sorry for yourself. That is a luxury you cannot afford right now." Then I went downstairs and had coffee, and Ruth drove me to Miles Brenner's office in her truck that smelled of pine needles and old leather, and we did not talk much on the drive because there was not much that needed saying. Miles's office was in the small town 8 miles from the mountain, a low building on a corner lot that looked, from outside, like it ought to contain a dentist rather than the most important papers of my life. Miles himself met us at the door, dressed in his weekend clothes, which he had clearly put on in some haste. He shook my hand with both of his and held it for a moment. "Eleanor," his eyes were serious behind the glasses. "Come in. We have a great deal to talk about." We sat in his conference room. Miles had files already out, not just the trust document, but bank records, correspondence, what appeared to be printed emails, and a series of dated notes in his own handwriting that went back, I realized as I looked at them, at least 3 months. "You've been documenting this," I said. "Since July," he said. When one of Grant's financial advisors contacted me and asked some questions about the trust structure that were not, let's say, casual inquiries, that was when I understood what direction this was heading. He paused. I should have told you sooner. I was hoping I was wrong. There was something in the admission that I appreciated, not the delay, but the honesty about it. Miles was a man who knew when he had made a suboptimal choice and was willing to say so directly, without a wall of justifications. Tell me everything now, I said. So he did. Over the next 2 hours, Miles laid it out. Grant had been, for the better part of a year, constructing a narrative, in legal documents, in conversations with financial institutions, in communications with at least 2 of the family's long-standing advisors, that I was declining. Mentally, the word he used across multiple communications was diminishing. He had suggested to the family's accountant that I had grown confused about certain account allocations. He had told the estate's insurance agent that I was having difficulty managing the property decisions. He had spoken to a physician, not my physician, a physician he had somehow located and paid for a consultation, and obtained a letter suggesting that individuals over 65 with my general health profile could benefit from supportive management of complex financial matters. That letter, I said, is it legitimate? It's legitimate in the sense that a real doctor signed it. It's not legitimate in the sense that it is based on 0 actual examination of you and constitutes, in my professional opinion, a fraudulent document obtained under false pretenses. Miles's tone was measured and precise, the way it got when he was genuinely angry but had decided that anger would not serve the moment. I've already been in contact with the state medical board. I sat with this. All of this had been happening for months, while I was sitting in the library reading letters from school principals, while I was chairing foundation meetings and managing the hotel correspondence and visiting the properties and doing every ordinary thing I did every ordinary day. My son had been building a cage around me, board by board, so carefully that I had not seen the walls until they were already closing in. The investors, I said. How many and how much? 14 investors at last count. Grant represented that the Vance estate, approximately $11 million in property value, and the hotel portfolio would serve as collateral for his development project. He's raised approximately $8 million in pledges based on that representation. The number landed heavily. He told them he controlled those assets. Yes, he does not control those assets. Correct. He has no legal authority over any Vance Trust asset. The document he used to access the household accounts was forged, and the forgery is, honestly, it is not subtle. It will not survive any scrutiny. Grant acted as if no one would check. Because he thought I would sign things, I said slowly. He thought he could get me to sign things, scare me into it, confuse me into it, or petition the court to have you declared incompetent and get a court-appointed conservator he could influence. That was the backup plan. Miles pulled a document from the file. He filed a motion 4 days ago. I stared at him. A competency motion. Filed quietly. He expected you would be alone, isolated, without resources, and that by the time you understood what was happening, the process would already be too far along to effectively challenge. Miles set the document on the table between us. He did not expect you to have a 40-year relationship with an attorney who had already been building a counterfile for 3 months. For the first time since the previous night, I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite warmth. Something more like the first movement of air in a room that has been sealed too long. What do? I asked. We file a counter motion today with a full competency evaluation from your actual physician, whom I'm calling this afternoon, and a complete response to his claims with supporting documentation. Miles folded his hands on the table. We also begin the process of filing a formal complaint with the district attorney's office regarding the forged document, the fraudulent account access, and the fraudulent misrepresentation made to investors. The investors, I said. What happens to them? They're going to want their money back, and they're going to be furious when they understand what Grant told them was fiction. He paused. Eleanor, I want to be direct with you. This is going to be a public process. There will be court filings. There will likely be press. Grant's investors will likely file their own civil actions against him. This is not going to be quiet. I thought about quiet, about the 41 years I had spent in that house, living a quiet and private life, protecting the Vance name with the specific discretion of someone who has been taught that dignity is demonstrated, not announced. I thought about standing in the snow in indoor shoes. "Let it be loud," I said. Grant called Ruth's in that afternoon. I did not know how he got the number, though I could guess it was a small mountain community and we had lived in it for 4 decades. He probably asked 3 people and had the answer in an hour. Ruth handed me the phone with an expression that suggested she had already formed an opinion about whether I should take the call. I took it anyway. "Mom." His voice was different from the night before. The bureaucratic smoothness was still there, but underneath it was something new. A very slight, very carefully controlled note of something I recognized after a moment as concern. Not concern for me. Concern about things not going according to plan. "Grant, I was worried about you. Where did you go last night? It was freezing." "I walked to Ruth's," I said, "through the snow in my house shoes." A pause. "Mom, I know last night was—" "Do not," I said. "Do not explain last night to me. Do not reframe it or describe it or apologize for it in a way that requires me to understand your perspective. I know exactly what last night was." Another pause. Longer. "You've talked to Miles." It wasn't a question. "I have." "Mom, Miles he's an old man. He's working off documents that are 40 years old, and he doesn't understand the current—" "Grant." I kept my voice even. This was important to me. The evenness. Because I knew, and he knew, that if I got loud, if I got emotional, he could use it. He had been building a file about my emotional instability for months. I was not going to give him a single thing more to work with. "Miles has filed counter motions this afternoon. He has been in contact with your investors' legal representatives, who will be learning today that the assets you offered as collateral are not yours to offer. He has also been in contact with the district attorney's office regarding the forged authorization document." Complete silence. "The forgery is quite detectable," I added, which was perhaps unkind. But I was 68 years old, and I had just walked 2 miles in the snow, and I allowed myself that one small cruelty. "Mom, I want you to hear me, Grant, because I'm going to say this once." I sat down in the chair by Ruth's front window. Outside, the snow was bright and cold, and the mountain stood clean against a clear sky. "You have not just tried to take money from me. You have tried to take my name, my safety, my right to live in my own home and manage my own affairs, and be treated as a person with a functioning mind and the dignity that comes from building 68 years of life. You have tried to take the foundation your father built and the legacy he left and reduce them to collateral for a development project that exists, as far as I can tell, primarily on paper and ambition." My voice stayed level. I was proud of that. "And you did it because you assumed I would not fight, that I am too old, too soft, too sentimental, too diminished." I let that word sit. "You were wrong." The silence on the other end of the line had a particular quality. I had been a mother long enough to know the difference between the silence of someone who is thinking and the silence of someone who is afraid. This was the second kind. "The motion you filed," I continued, "withdraw it today. Because if it goes forward, I will let Miles put every document, every forged signature, every conversation with your investors into the public record of those proceedings. And then you will not just lose the trust, you will lose everything you have built separately, because the investors will have grounds for fraud claims, and the people you have spent your career convincing that you are a man of integrity will have the paperwork to prove otherwise." Silence. "Mom, Withdraw the motion, Grant." I handed the phone back to Ruth. She looked at me with an expression I could not quite categorize. Not pity, not triumph, something in the territory of profound sadness for the way things sometimes go between parents and children. She had her own complicated stories with her own children. We had talked about some of them over the years. "Well?" she said. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "He's afraid." But Grant has always made his worst decisions when he's afraid. I was right about that. He did not withdraw the motion. Instead, 3 days later, he showed up at Ruth's Inn in the early morning, alone this time. No advisors, no Marissa, no briefcases. He knocked on the front door like a visitor, which I suppose he was. Ruth opened the door and looked at him without expression for a long moment, then looked over her shoulder at me, and I nodded. He came inside. He stood in the front room of the inn with his coat in his hands. He had taken it off before coming in, which was either a gesture of humility or a performance of one, and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was a teenager. Something raw and cornered and young. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Not about lawyers, just, I need to talk to you." Ruth disappeared into the back without a word. Grant sat down. I waited. "I'm in a lot of trouble," he said finally. His voice was quiet, stripped of the smooth management tone he had been wearing for weeks. "The development, it's been over budget for a year. The investors are starting to ask questions I can't answer. I thought if I could use the estate as a foundation, show them the assets, buy myself enough time to—" He stopped. "I thought I could fix it before anyone got hurt." "I got hurt," I said. He looked at the floor. "I know." "You put me in the snow, Grant." "I know." His voice had something in it that might have been genuine shame. I did not let myself lean toward it too quickly. I had made that mistake before. "And you have spent months telling people that your mother is losing her mind," I said. Not because it was true, because it was useful. He did not deny it. That was something, I supposed. "I don't know how it got this far," he said. I kept thinking it would work out, that I could fix it, that you would, that once you understood the financial situation, you would want to help. You could have asked me for help." The words came out with a sharpness I had not entirely planned. "Grant, you could have come to me and said, 'I'm in trouble,' and I don't know what I would have done. I am not without resources, and I am not without compassion, even for a child who has not always deserved it. You could have asked." He was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't think you'd take me seriously," he said. "I thought you'd think I was failing." I stared at him. "So instead," I said slowly, "you decided to take everything I had, because that felt less shameful than admitting to me that you needed help." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. And in that silence, I understood something about my son that I had been circling for years without quite landing on. Grant had never learned how to be small, had never learned how to fail honestly, in front of another person, and accept the discomfort of being seen without achievement to hide behind. Harold and I had given him everything, protected him from too many consequences, smoothed too many paths. We had loved him into a kind of brittleness, a man who could not ask for help without feeling destroyed by the asking, and so found other ways to get what he needed that did not require him to be vulnerable. We had done that. Some portion of what sat across from me in that chair was our creation. That understanding did not change what he had done. Let me be very clear about that. Understanding the roots of cruelty does not obligate you to accept it or forgive it before it has been properly accounted for. But it changed the texture of my anger, made it less about Grant as a monster and more about Grant as a man who had made choices, a series of escalating, calculating, devastating choices that had consequences he was only now beginning to feel. "You need to withdraw the competency motion," I said, "and you need to sit down with Miles and account for everything you've done. Every forged document, every account access, every conversation you had with investors about assets you did not own." I paused. "And then we will talk about what comes next." He looked up. Something flickering in his face that might have been relief, might have been calculation. With Grant, I had stopped being entirely sure I could tell the difference. "You'd talk to me," he said, "after all this." "I would talk to you," I said carefully. "That is all I am promising. A conversation, not absolution, not a clean slate, not access to the trust or the estate or the accounts. A conversation." He nodded slowly. I stood up. My back ached. I had not slept enough in 3 days, and I was wearing borrowed clothes, and I was conducting the most consequential negotiation of my life in a roadside inn that smelled of wood smoke and old coffee. Go home, Grant, I said. Call Miles in the morning, and do not— I held his gaze until I was sure he understood I was not softening this next part. Do not make the mistake of thinking this conversation means you have won anything. You have not. What you have is a mother who is not yet finished deciding how much damage she intends to allow. He left. I stood at the window and watched his car go down the road until it turned at the bottom of the hill and disappeared, and then I sat back down in the chair by the window and looked at the mountain. The snow was beginning to melt at the edges where the sun hit it, slowly, imperceptibly. The kind of change you could only see if you watched long enough. Grant had come to me seeking forgiveness. What he was going to get instead was a reckoning, and it was coming faster than he knew. Grant did not withdraw the motion. I had given him a night to do the right thing. Then a second night, because Miles counseled patience, and I had agreed, though patience felt increasingly like a luxury I was purchasing with my own dignity. By the morning of the third day, Miles called me at Ruth's Inn while I was sitting at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee and the first genuine appetite I had felt in a week. He's not withdrawing, Miles said without preamble. His attorney filed a response to our counter motion this morning. They're pushing forward. I set down my coffee cup. What does the response say? It says, I heard papers moving, that you are demonstrably resistant to appropriate care, that your refusal to accept assistance is itself evidence of impaired judgment, and that your current living situation, by which they mean Ruth's Inn, demonstrates your inability to manage your own affairs. A pause. They also suggest that your relationship with this office represents a conflict of interest, given my long personal association with you, and they're asking the court to appoint an independent evaluator. I was quiet for a moment. They're calling my friendship with you a liability, I said. Yes. And my refusal to be warehoused in a facility is evidence that I'm incompetent. That is their argument, yes. I looked out Ruth's kitchen window at the mountain. The snow was still deep up near the ridge, but the road below had cleared. Life resuming its ordinary patterns, indifferent to whatever was happening to me personally. A truck went by. A woman walked a dog. 2 weeks ago, I had been in my library reading a letter about 14 children learning to read. Miles, I said, I want to go home. A beat of silence. Eleanor, I know I can't. Not yet. But I want you to understand that is what this is about for me. Not victory, not punishment. I want to go back to my house and sit in my library and be in the rooms Harold built, and I am going to do that. Whatever it takes. I understand, Miles said, and I believed him. Then here is what we need to do. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. 3 weeks in which Grant, from what Miles's contacts reported, moved with escalating urgency. The urgency of a man who had committed too deeply to a plan to abandon it and was now running on the particular reckless momentum of someone who cannot afford to lose. He held a dinner for his investors. Miles learned about it from a source I will not name, someone inside Grant's circle who had begun to feel the moral weight of what they were participating in and had quietly made a phone call. At the dinner, Grant apparently presented updated projections for his development project and described the Vance estate and hotel portfolio as assets that would be fully accessible within the month. He spoke with confidence. He showed renderings. He poured expensive wine and talked about the future. When Miles told me this, I felt a cold that had nothing to do with weather. He's still telling them he has access to assets he doesn't have, I said. Yes. Miles, that's fraud. That's active, ongoing fraud in front of witnesses. I know, Miles said, and every person in that room who can testify to what he said becomes a witness we may need. Meanwhile, Grant's attorney sent a series of letters to the estate's remaining staff. Rosa, Thomas, who handled the grounds in Philip's absence, and 2 other long-term employees, informing them that their continued employment depended on cooperating with the transition of estate management, and that any communications with me or with my legal representatives should be reported to Grant's office. Rosa called me from her personal cell phone the morning after she received the letter. She was whispering, which told me she was somewhere she didn't want to be overheard. Mrs. Vance, she said, I need you to know I am not going to do what that letter says. Rosa, I don't want you to put your job at risk. My job, she said, with a quiet firmness that I found unexpectedly moving, has been working for you for 18 years, not for your son. And I've been thinking about something since he came that night. A pause. The security system, the cameras on the exterior, they recorded that night, Mrs. Vance, the whole thing, including him telling you to leave, and you trying your key. The world went slightly still. Does Grant know about the footage? I don't think he thought about it. He was focused on the locks and the staff. He didn't ask about the security system. Rosa, I kept my voice steady with some effort. Do not mention this to anyone. Not to Grant, not to his people. Can you get the footage saved somewhere he cannot delete it? Already done, she said. I sent a copy to my personal email the morning after, and another copy to my sister's house on a drive. For a moment I could not speak. This woman who had worked in my home for 18 years, who had brought me soup when Harold died, who had stood in my hallway with folded hands and told me the truth about what Grant had asked her, had thought to do what I had not thought to do, had protected me from around a corner I hadn't seen. Thank you, I said. It came out rough. Just come home, Mrs. Vance, she said. Come home soon. I have to tell you about a moment that happened 10 days before the hearing because it changed something in me that needed changing. Ruth had a habit of sitting on the inn's small front porch in the late afternoon, even in cold weather, wrapped in a heavy coat with a mug of something hot, watching the road. She said she had done it for 20 years, that the parade of people and vehicles going by, even on a quiet mountain road, was her particular form of entertainment. I had started joining her, partly for company, and partly because the inn's four walls, comfortable as they were, had begun to feel like their own kind of trap. We were sitting there one afternoon when an older woman came walking up the road. She was perhaps 75, 80, small and slow-moving, carrying 2 grocery bags that were clearly too heavy for her. She stopped at the bottom of the inn's drive to rest, setting the bags down and pressing one hand to her lower back. Ruth was off her chair before I had fully registered what was happening, moving down the porch steps with the particular purposeful speed of a woman who does not wait to be asked. Let me take those, she said, already reaching for the bags. Come in and warm up for a minute. The woman looked startled, then grateful in the way that people are grateful when unexpected kindness finds them in a moment of genuine need. Not just pleased, but slightly undone by it, as if they had forgotten kindness was still available. Her name was Dorothy. She lived a mile up the road. Her car was in the shop, and her son, she mentioned her son with a careful lightness that told me there was a great deal she was choosing not to say, was busy. She had needed groceries. Ruth made her tea. I sat across from her at the kitchen table. Dorothy told us slowly and without drama that she had been managing on her own for about 2 years since her husband passed, that the winters were hard, that her son checked in but not regularly, that she had stopped telling people when things were difficult because the alternative, the conversations about facilities and care plans and whether she was really managing, felt worse than just managing. People see a woman my age living alone and they think the story is almost over, Dorothy said. She was not bitter when she said it. She was matter-of-fact, which somehow made it worse. They don't see everything that's still happening inside. The things you still think about, still want, still plan. She paused, looking at her tea. I have a garden. I've been planning what I'm going to plant in spring for weeks now. Nobody asks about that. I thought about Grant's letter to his doctors, describing my general health profile, the careful language of a man erasing a person, replacing them with a category. I sat at Ruth's kitchen table listening to Dorothy talk about her spring garden, and I felt the particular clarity that sometimes only comes from seeing your own situation reflected in someone else's. Because this was it. This was what the world looked like when it decided that age was the same as diminishment, when it looked at women like Dorothy, like me, and saw problems to be managed rather than people still fully alive in their own stories. I was not going to accept that categorization, not for myself. And something else was forming in me, sitting at that table, that I didn't yet have language for, a sense that what was happening to me was not just about me, and that whatever came next might need to be larger than personal vindication. But that was still forming, still rough and unresolved at the edges. I set it aside and finished my tea. 11 days before the hearing, Grant came back. This time he did not come to the inn. He came to Miles's office, uninvited, without an appointment, while I happened to be there reviewing documents. Miles's assistant came to the conference room door and said, with admirable composure, that Grant Vance was in the reception area asking to speak with his mother. Miles looked at me. I looked at Miles. "Send him in," I said. Miles stayed. I had asked him to stay regardless of what Grant said about wanting a private conversation, because I had made a decision after the last encounter at Ruth's Inn. I was not going to be alone with my son without a witness again. Not out of fear. Out of the hard-won understanding that certain people, when they feel cornered, become the most dangerous version of themselves, and that there was nothing to be gained from giving Grant an audience with no accountability. He came in looking like he hadn't slept well for several days, which I recognized as probably true. His suit was right, but his eyes were wrong. Too wide, slightly frantic, the eyes of a man running calculations that kept not adding up. He looked at Miles. Miles looked back at him with the pleasant, impassive expression of a man who has been doing this for 50 years and has seen every variety of desperation walk through his door. "I need to talk to my mother," Grant said. "Hello, Grant," I said. "Sit down." He sat. He put his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at me and said, "Withdraw your counterfiling. Let the evaluation go forward. Whatever the evaluator finds, I'll accept it." I studied him. "You'll accept it," I said. "Yes, if the evaluator says if you pass." "If I pass," I repeated, as if it's an exam. You know what I mean." "I know exactly what you mean," I said, "and I want you to hear what you're asking me. You want me to submit to a court-ordered competency evaluation proposed by the son who forged documents and froze my accounts and changed my locks and put me out in the snow, and trust that this process will be fair and that you will honor whatever it finds." I paused. "And in exchange, what do I get?" He hesitated. "I'll back off the estate, stop the transition planning." "You'll stop the planning you had no legal authority to do in the first place." He pressed his lips together. The frantic quality behind his eyes intensified slightly. "The investors are pulling out," he said quietly. Something in his voice dropped, not quite to honesty, but toward it. "Two of them have already filed preliminary notices. If the rest follow, then your development collapses," I said. "Mom, I know, Grant, I know it collapses. I know what happens to you when it does. I have thought about that. I have spent actual time these past weeks thinking about what your life looks like on the other side of all of this." I looked at my son. "And I am going to tell you something that I need you to actually hear. Not hear and immediately begin calculating around. Actually hear." He was quiet. "You brought this here," I said. "Not me, not Miles, not the investors or the banks or the legal system. You. You made a choice. Not one choice, a long series of choices over many months, and each one was worse than the last, and at any point you could have stopped and come to me honestly, and we could have talked about what was possible. And you chose not to. You chose this." My voice stayed even. I was proud of that still. "So I will not be withdrawing my counterfiling, and I will not be submitting to an evaluation process designed by you, and the hearing will proceed as scheduled. And at that hearing, everything you have done will be in the public record." Grant's jaw worked. Something moved across his face. Anger, I thought. And beneath the anger, something uglier and more primitive. Something that recognized it was losing and had not yet accepted the implications. "You'll destroy me," he said. "In court. In front of everyone. You'll destroy me." "You made that possible," I said. "I didn't." He stood up abruptly. The chair scraped back. He put his hands flat on the conference table and leaned forward and said, in a voice that was very controlled and very quiet and therefore more frightening than if he had shouted, "I will have you declared incompetent. I will get my own doctors, my own evaluators, and I will stand in that courtroom and tell them that my mother is not capable of managing her own life, and people will believe me because I am her son, and I am the one who has been watching her decline. And you will spend the rest of your life in a facility fighting a label you can't shake because once those questions get asked, they follow you everywhere." The room was absolutely silent. Miles was very still beside me. I looked at my son. This man I had carried and nursed and fought for and sacrificed for across 4 decades of loving him, across every disappointment and difficulty and quiet grief of watching a child become someone you hadn't entirely intended. And I said, "Then I'll let the judge hear what you did in the cold." Grant looked at me. I held his gaze without flinching. "Every detail," I said. "The forged document, the account access, the investors, the doctor's letter you obtained without examining me, the night of the storm, including the security footage Rosa preserved, showing you handing my housekeeper a new key and telling your own mother to leave her home in 12 below zero temperatures with no coat, no phone, and no way to call for help." I stood up slowly because my back was still complaining from those weeks of disrupted sleep and my body was not interested in dramatic gestures. I stood up anyway. "I am 68 years old, and I walked 2 miles through a blizzard in my house shoes because my son decided I was an inconvenience. I am going to be just fine in front of a judge. The question is whether you will be." Grant straightened. For a moment he was just standing there, and something in his face, the frantic calculation, the controlled anger, all of it, went very still, like a machine that had been running hot and suddenly stopped. Then he picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "I'll see you in court," he said, and he left. The door closed. Miles and I sat in the silence for a moment. Then Miles said, "Well." "Yes," I said. "For what it's worth, Eleanor," he folded his hands on the table. "That was exactly right." I sat back down. My legs felt unreliable, which I chose not to mention. "I told him the truth, that's all." "You did." "And now he has to decide what he wants the courtroom to look like." Miles reached for the folder in front of him and opened it with the manner of a man returning to work, because work, in his experience, was the most reliable antidote to the emotional residue of difficult moments. "Let me walk you through the witnesses we're planning to call." We spent the next 2 hours going through it. The shape of what we were building in that conference room, document by document and witness by witness, was not just a legal defense. It was a reconstruction of who I was, who Harold had been, what the Vance Trust actually said and meant, and what Grant had actually done. Miles was thorough in the way of someone who has been preparing for this for longer than I had been aware. Ruth testified, as it turned out, not because Miles had asked her to, but because she had called him and asked if she could. She had witnessed Grant's behavior at the inn during his 2 visits, the controlled aggression, the pressure, the particular quality of a man who was trying to manage a situation rather than resolve it. She was precise about what she had seen and heard, and she was not given to exaggeration, which Miles told me would make her an excellent witness. Rosa was prepared to testify about everything: the phone call from Grant asking about my schedule and my level of functioning, the letter threatening staff who communicated with me, and the security footage she had preserved. When Miles first reviewed that footage, he called me afterward and said only, "The footage is definitive, Eleanor. It shows exactly what happened." Philip, the groundskeeper who had been summarily dismissed, had kept every communication from Grant's office and was willing to testify about the sequence of dismissals and the instructions he had received. And then there was Thomas Garrett. Thomas was one of Grant's investors. 51, a real estate developer himself from the northern part of the state, a man who had invested $250,000 in Grant's project based on the representation that the Vance estate would serve as collateral. When Miles's office reached out to his attorney, carefully, correctly, through the proper channels, Thomas had responded within 24 hours. He wanted to talk. Miles sat across from Thomas Garrett in his conference room 3 days before the hearing, and I was present, and Thomas Garrett said, with the controlled fury of a man who had been deceived by someone he had trusted, "Grant told me explicitly," he said, and I have an email, that the Vance estate was fully under his control and that his mother had transitioned management to him. He said she had done it voluntarily. He showed me documents. "Documents you have copies of?" Miles asked. "My lawyers have copies of everything Grant ever sent us." Thomas looked at me then, not with pity, which I appreciated, but with something more like the respect that one gives to someone who has been wronged in a way that has consequences. "Mrs. Vance, I'm sorry this happened to you, and I want you to know I'm going to tell the court exactly what Grant told us, because what he told us was a lie, and people need to know that." I thanked him. He nodded. After he left, Miles was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That's 13 witnesses, Eleanor. 13 people who will walk into that courtroom and describe, from their own direct experience, what Grant Vance did." I thought about Grant in my conference room 3 days ago, telling me he would have me declared incompetent and that the label would follow me everywhere. The confidence of it. The assumption that his narrative was the durable one, the one that courts and institutions and investors would accept, because he had spent a year carefully constructing it. He had forgotten something fundamental about the truth. The truth does not require maintenance. It simply requires one person willing to insist on it, and then the whole structure you built around it starts to crack. "Miles," I said, "there's something I want to do before the hearing." He looked at me. "I want to go back to the estate." A pause. "Eleanor, Grant is still... I know he's still there. I don't want to go in. I just want to see it." I thought for a moment, trying to articulate something that was more instinct than argument. "I've been away from my home for almost 3 weeks. I've been living in borrowed clothes in a friend's inn, and I am grateful for that, genuinely, but I need to see my home. I need to remember what I'm fighting for, not in the abstract, the actual place, the actual walls." Miles studied me. "All right," he said after a moment, "I'll come with you." We drove up the mountain road on a Thursday afternoon, 2 days before the hearing, in Miles's car with the heater running and the winter afternoon going gray around us. The road was clear. The trees were bare and black against a white sky. I watched them go by and thought about the number of times I had driven this road, to school events and hospital visits and grocery runs and airport pickups, and the 100 ordinary journeys that compose a life spent in one place. When the estate came into view, I asked Miles to stop the car. He pulled over. We sat there with the engine running. The house looked the same: limestone and dark wood, the long porch, the dormant gardens wrapped in their winter mulch, the big windows that caught light and held it in the particular way Harold had always loved. Lights were on inside, the library, the kitchen, the front hall. Someone else's lights in my windows, someone else using the warmth Harold had built. I looked at it for a long time. I did not cry. I want to tell you I cried because that would be a neater emotional moment. But what I felt sitting there was not sadness exactly. It was something more like resolve in its rawest form, not the resolved, clear-eyed certainty of a character in a story who has found her path, but the gritty, tired, slightly furious determination of a real person who is not finished and knows it. "Okay," I said. Miles put the car back in gear. Atir. The night before the hearing, I did not sleep. I lay in Ruth's corner room. I had come to think of it as mine in the way you claim temporary spaces that have held you through difficult things. And I thought about Harold. This time not with grief and not with loss, but with the specific kind of conversation you have with people who are no longer present, but whose voice you still carry. Harold had been meticulous about the trust, obsessive about it, actually, in a way that had occasionally irritated me during the years of its creation. All those meetings with Miles, all those late evening conversations about clauses and contingencies and what would happen if. I had sometimes thought he was borrowing trouble, planning for disasters that would not come. He had been planning for this. Not this specifically. He had not sat in that attorney's office 40 years ago thinking, one day our son will forge documents and lock Eleanor out of the house. He was not that pessimistic about Grant, and neither was I. And I will not pretend otherwise. But Harold was a man who understood that love does not always survive wealth. That money has a way of revealing character, not creating it, but revealing what was already there. And he had loved his family enough to build a structure that could survive the revelation. I thought about that, about the gift of being loved by someone who planned for your protection even when you did not know you would need it, who looked at the future and saw not just the good versions but the difficult ones and said quietly, without drama, "I will make sure she is safe." I pressed my face into the pillow and held that thought. In the morning, I got dressed in clothes Miles's assistant had quietly arranged for me. A gray suit, simple and well-made, the kind of clothes that say I am serious and I am here without performing. Ruth drove me to the courthouse. She did not say much. At the entrance, she put her hand briefly on my arm. "You know what you're doing," she said. It was not a question. I took it as the gift she intended it to be. I walked up the courthouse steps. The hearing room was smaller than I had expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting that was slightly too harsh, the institutional smell of a public building that has processed a great deal of human difficulty without particularly absorbing any of it. There were gallery seats, maybe 40 of them. Miles had told me the hearing was nominally closed to the general public, but that certain interested parties, Grant's investors, their legal representatives, had been permitted to observe. I walked in and found my seat beside Miles. Across the aisle, Grant sat with his legal team. 3 attorneys. He was dressed impeccably. Dark suit, the tie Harold had given him for his 40th birthday, which I recognized and which struck me as either calculated or completely unconscious, and I was not sure which was more disturbing. He did not look at me when I came in. Marissa was in the gallery. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged in its practiced expression of composed concern, and she was wearing the camel coat she'd had on that night at the estate. I wondered if that was also calculated. I wondered how much of Marissa's life was calculated, and how much was simply who she was, and whether there was even a difference anymore. Thomas Garrett was in the gallery, 2 rows back, with a man I took to be his attorney. 2 other men I did not recognize sat apart from the main groups. Miles leaned toward me and said quietly, "State Attorney's Office. They have an observer here regarding the fraud allegation." I absorbed this. The judge entered. Her name was Judge Patricia Holt. 60, silver hair pulled back, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She sat, arranged her papers, looked briefly around the room, and said, in a voice that suggested she had done this many times and intended to do it efficiently, "We're here on the matter of Vance Competency Review, case number 2024-CV-1-847. I've reviewed the preliminary filings from both sides." She looked up over the glasses. "I'll say at the outset that this is one of the more extensively documented competency filings I have seen. Both sides appear to have been thorough. We will proceed with opening statements and then move to witnesses." She looked toward Grant's table. "Counsel for the petitioner." Grant's lead attorney, a man named Aldrich, who had the smooth, unhurried manner of someone who had won a lot of courtroom arguments and expected to win this one, stood and spent 12 minutes describing, in the measured language of legal advocacy, a concerned son watching his mother's decline. He used words like diminishment and increasing isolation and demonstrated impairment. He described the Foundation's recent financial decisions as increasingly erratic. He described my management of the estate accounts as inconsistent with established financial practice. He described my reaction on the night of the storm, my raising of my voice, my insistence that everyone leave, as an episode that concerned multiple witnesses. I sat still. I listened to a very articulate man describe a version of me that did not exist, and I sat still because I had made a decision about this hearing, which was that everything I did in it would demonstrate the thing Grant's team was arguing I was incapable of. Composure, reason, clarity. The courtroom itself was the evaluation. Then Miles stood. Miles was not smooth in the way of Aldrich. He was something more old-fashioned, which in a courtroom setting turned out to be its own kind of authority. He spoke slowly, and he did not perform confidence. He simply had it, the way you have things that have been part of you long enough to stop being visible. He told the court, in plain and specific language, what the Vance Trust said and what it required. He described the protection clause. He described briefly and with documentation what Grant had done. The forged document, the account access, the staff dismissals, the lock change, the investors. He said, "My client walked 2 miles through a blizzard in indoor shoes because her son changed her locks. The question before this court is not whether Eleanor Vance is competent to manage her affairs. The question is whether her son is competent to make claims about her affairs, given what he has demonstrably done." The room was very quiet. Grant's attorney objected to the framing. Judge Holt allowed it anyway. Miles sat back down beside me. He did not look at me. We both looked forward, and I thought, this is it. This is where it turns. The first witness was called. Outside the courthouse windows, the winter sky was going from gray to the particular pale gold that comes in late afternoon when the sun is low and the cold is clean and the light seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The kind of sky that Harold used to point out, always. no matter what else was happening. "Look at that," he would say. "Just look at that." I looked forward at the courtroom, at my son's carefully dressed back, at the judge with her reading glasses and her patience, and I thought, I am looking, Harold. I am looking at exactly what's in front of me. And I was ready. The first witness Grant's team called was the doctor. His name was Dr. Raymond Skull, and he was 54 years old and had the particular bearing of a man who is accustomed to being the most credentialed person in any given room and had built his personality around that expectation. He wore a good suit and carried himself with the careful confidence of someone who had rehearsed his testimony and believed genuinely that the rehearsal had made it unassailable. He settled into the witness chair. Grant's attorney Aldrich approached him with the ease of a man who has choreographed this before. "Dr. Skull, can you describe the nature of your professional assessment of Eleanor Vance?" "Certainly." He folded his hands. "I was retained to provide a clinical opinion regarding cognitive function in an individual matching Mrs. Vance's demographic profile. Age 68, significant recent life changes including spousal loss, social isolation, and management of complex financial responsibilities. Based on the profile I was given and published research on cognitive decline in comparable demographics, I offered a preliminary opinion that professional oversight of financial decision-making would be clinically advisable." Aldrich nodded thoughtfully. "And that opinion was based on published research, clinical experience, and the detailed profile provided to me by—" "The profile," Miles said, from beside me. His voice was perfectly modulated, quiet enough to be respectful, clear enough to be heard by everyone in the room. "Your Honor, I'd like to note for the record that the witness just described his assessment as based on a profile provided to him, rather than a clinical examination." Judge Holt looked at Dr. Skull over her reading glasses. "Doctor, did you examine Mrs. Vance?" A fractional pause. "I conducted a file review and— Did you examine Mrs. Vance? In person, as a patient?" A longer pause. "No," he said. "I was not given access to—" "Thank you," Judge Holt said. Her voice was pleasant and final. "Mr. Aldrich, you may continue, but I want to note that I will be weighing this testimony accordingly." Aldrich recovered quickly. He was good at recovery, I will give him that, and spent another 10 minutes having Dr. Skull explain the research basis for his opinions. The testimony was technically competent and humanly empty, the way things are when someone has built an argument around a conclusion they were paid to reach. I watched the judge's face while Dr. Skull spoke. She listened with the patience of someone who was being thorough rather than persuaded. Then Miles cross-examined him. Miles stood, unhurried, and said, "Dr. Skull, you mentioned you were given a profile. Who provided that profile?" "Mr. Grant Vance." "The petitioner in this case?" "Yes." "Did the profile include any documentation from Mrs. Vance's actual physician?" "It included a summary." "A summary prepared by Mr. Vance's office?" A pause. "Yes." "Did you speak with Mrs. Vance's physician directly?" "I was told that access to her physician was—" "Doctor," Miles's voice stayed courteous. "Yes or no? Did you speak with Mrs. Vance's physician?" "No." "Did you review any medical records from Mrs. Vance's actual treating physician?" "No." "Did you meet Eleanor Vance, speak with her, observe her, evaluate her in any clinical capacity whatsoever?" "No." Miles let that sit for exactly the right number of seconds, not performing, just allowing the room to hear what it had just heard. "No further questions," he said. Grant's table was very still. I did not look at Grant directly. I was aware of him the way you are aware of weather, peripherally, constantly, with the particular alertness that comes from knowing conditions can change. Aldrich called a financial consultant next, a man named Derek Park, who had reviewed the Foundation's recent grant allocations and had prepared a report suggesting irregular decision-making patterns in my management of the Foundation budget. He was precise, and he had documentation, and he spoke with the assurance of someone who understands numbers well enough to make them say whatever is needed. Miles, on cross, asked him one question. "Mr. Park, the grant allocations you've characterized as irregular. Can you tell the court what outcomes those grants produced?" Derek Park blinked. Outcomes aren't within the scope of my. You were asked to evaluate the financial decisions of the Vance Family Foundation, but you did not investigate what those financial decisions achieved. My analysis was focused on the allocation methodology. So you can tell us the money was spent differently than you might have spent it, but you cannot tell us whether the spending worked. Aldrich objected. Judge Holt sustained it, but the question had already done what questions do when they're the right ones. It had stayed in the room. Miles then introduced his exhibit, a document from my actual physician, Dr. Sandra Cho, who had been my doctor for 11 years, which was a full cognitive and physical assessment completed the week after I arrived at Ruth's Inn on Miles's request. It was thorough. It was professional. It described a woman in good health with no evidence of cognitive impairment, no signs of dementia or diminished capacity, and, in a line that Dr. Cho had added, apparently with some feeling, exceptional clarity and organizational capacity given the extraordinary circumstances she has recently endured. Aldrich objected to the characterization. Judge Holt allowed the document. Grant's team had 3 more witnesses. I will not detail each of them because what they said, taken individually, was less important than what they added up to, which was a portrait of a woman constructed entirely from the secondhand testimony of people who had received their information from Grant. Not one of Grant's witnesses had an independent, unmediated relationship with me. Every single one of them knew me through the filter of what Grant had told them. Miles made sure the court understood this, calmly and without editorial, by the time the last one finished. Then it was our turn. Ruth was first. She walked to the witness stand with the particular dignity of a woman who has spent decades running a business alone and has learned that competence is its own form of authority. She did not dress up for the occasion. She wore what she wore, a good wool blazer, practical shoes, and she answered every question with the directness of someone who has no investment in the story, coming out any particular way except the true way. She described my arrival at the inn, the temperature, my clothing, the state I was in physically. She described what I had told her and what she had observed in the days since, my clarity of mind, my conversations with Miles, my conduct with Thomas Garrett, and others who had come through the inn. Then Aldrich cross-examined her. Ms. Calloway, you've been friends with Eleanor Vance for over 30 years, correct? 31 years, Ruth said. So you would characterize your relationship as one of deep personal loyalty. I would characterize my relationship as a friendship, Ruth said, which means I tell Eleanor the truth, including when I disagree with her, which I have done on a number of occasions over 31 years. That's not the same as loyalty that makes me blind. Aldrich smiled slightly. But you're not a medical professional. No. So your assessment of her cognitive state is based on 31 years of knowing her, Ruth said, versus your witness's 0 years of meeting her. She said it pleasantly, without heat, but it landed. Aldrich moved on. Rosa testified next. She had dressed carefully for this, a dark blazer, hair-pinned back, the appearance of someone who understood that how you present yourself in a courtroom is its own form of testimony. She was composed in the way of a person who has been frightened and has decided that fear will not govern their choices. She described the phone call from Grant asking about my schedule. She described the letter threatening staff. She described the night of the storm, what she had seen, what she had heard, where she had been standing when Grant handed Thomas the new key and told him the locks were done. And then Miles introduced the security footage. Grant's attorney objected on 3 grounds. Judge Holt overruled all 3. The screen at the front of the courtroom, a portable display that Miles's office had arranged, flickered to life. I did not watch the footage. I had seen it once in Miles's office 3 days before the hearing. I had watched it once, and I had not watched it again, because once was enough to understand what it showed and to know that watching it a second time would cost me something I needed to hold on to going into this room. Instead, I watched the room watching it. I watched Grant's attorneys exchange a look that was controlled and quick and told me everything about how their private assessment of the situation differed from the confident public performance they had been delivering all morning. I watched Marissa in the gallery. She was looking at the screen with an expression I had not expected. Not defiance, not the careful, composed concern she had been wearing all morning. Something that looked, from where I sat, like the particular discomfort of a person watching something they had known about and chosen not to stop. I watched Thomas Garrett, 2 rows back. He was leaning forward slightly, his forearms on his knees, and his jaw was tight, and he was watching the screen with the expression of a man whose anger has just found its final focus. I watched the 2 observers from the state attorney's office. They were both writing, and I watched Judge Holt. She watched the footage with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who is doing the most important part of their job, and her face told me nothing, which with a judge of her experience meant she was taking it seriously. The footage lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. When it ended, the room was quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary courtroom silence. It had a quality of collective settling, as if everyone in it had just recalibrated something. Rosa was asked about the footage by Aldrich. His cross-examination was shorter than it might have been. There was not much to work with. Philip testified next, briefly. He described his dismissal, the phone call, the words used, the absence of any prior discussion or indication of performance issues in 22 years of employment. He was 64 years old and had worked those grounds since before Grant could drive, and he described what had happened to him without bitterness, but with the weight of a man describing a genuine wrong that he had no framework to make sense of. The jury, there was no jury. This was a judge's hearing, but I thought of the gallery that way. Felt it. Then Miles called Thomas Garrett. Thomas took the stand with the bearing of a man who had made a decision and was not second-guessing it. He was 51, built solidly, with the kind of contained energy that belongs to people who are used to running things, and are currently running very hot with something that is just barely under control. Miles asked him to describe his investment in Grant's project. Thomas described it in detail. The conversations, the representations Grant had made, the documents. He had copies of emails. Miles introduced them, in which Grant explicitly stated that the Vance estate and hotel portfolio were fully under my management authority and available as collateral for the development fund. He had Grant's signed letter to the investor group, dated 8 months ago, describing a complete transition of Vance family assets to Vance Capital Development that had, Grant wrote, been agreed upon by all family principals. Mrs. Vance was described as having agreed to this transition? Miles asked. In writing, Thomas said. He reached into his jacket pocket almost reflexively before his attorney put a hand briefly on his arm to remind him the document was already in evidence. And to your knowledge, was that representation accurate? Thomas looked at me for the first time since taking the stand. No, it was not. Mrs. Vance had not agreed to anything. She didn't even know this document existed. Aldrich cross-examined Thomas with a line of questioning that attempted to frame him as a disgruntled investor seeking to deflect responsibility for his own due diligence failures. Thomas accepted the critique of his due diligence with a directness that actually made it harder to use against him. Yes, he said, he should have verified the representations independently. He had not done so. That was a mistake he owned. But none of that changed what Grant had told him, and none of it changed that it was false. Mr. Garrett, Aldrich said toward the end, you've described a financial loss. Isn't it possible that your characterization of Grant Vance's representations is being colored by your current financial interest in this proceeding? Thomas looked at him. I'm here, Thomas said, because a 68-year-old woman was thrown out of her house in a blizzard, and the man who did it is sitting in that chair. He did not gesture toward Grant. He did not need to. My financial interest is secondary to the fact that I looked her in the face 3 weeks ago and heard what happened, and I am not going to sit on information that's relevant to a court because it's inconvenient for me. He paused. I've done business for 26 years. I've made mistakes. I have never, in 26 years, misrepresented assets I didn't own to people who were trusting me. That's the difference between me and Grant Vance. Aldrich had no further questions. The afternoon session began after a brief recess, during which I stood in the courthouse hallway with Miles and drank a cup of terrible vending machine coffee and did not say much. Miles reviewed his notes. I looked at the wall across from me. Institutional beige, a fire safety poster, a small framed print of a mountain landscape that someone had hung there probably 20 years ago, and that now carried the slightly faded quality of things that have been overlooked for so long they have become invisible. I thought about Harold again. Not with grief this time, with something closer to gratitude. He had planned for this. He had sat with Miles 40 years ago and built something that would outlast his own presence, that would stand between the people he loved and the worst versions of what could happen. And he had done it quietly, without drama, without telling me to be grateful for precautions I couldn't yet see the need for. He had simply built it, the way he had built the house. With care and without announcement, as if protection were just the natural thing to offer the people you loved. When the recess ended, Miles called one final witness, Miles himself. This was unusual, an attorney testifying in his own case, and Aldrich immediately moved to object. Judge Holt allowed it with conditions, noting that Miles was being called in his capacity as the trust document's author and that his testimony would be limited to the trust provisions and their legal meaning. Aldrich's objections were noted and noted and noted, and ultimately the document was the document and Miles had written it. Miles took the stand with the slight awkwardness of a man who is more comfortable on the other side of the witness box, and he described the Vance Trust in the same careful, unhurried language he had used with me in his conference room 3 weeks ago. He described Harold's intentions. He described the voluntary transfer requirement. He described the protection clause. "Mr. Brenner," Judge Holt said, when Miles had finished his prepared statement, "I want to make sure I understand the protection clause correctly. You're saying that if a designated successor engages in exploitation or abandonment of the living trustee, they are automatically disqualified." "That is correct, Your Honor. Automatically, not subject to trustee discretion or a separate proceeding. The language is unambiguous. Automatic disqualification upon verified trigger events. Harold Vance was very specific about this. He had seen, in his professional life, too many estates become battlegrounds because the protection mechanisms required additional litigation to activate. He did not want that." Miles paused. He wanted Eleanor to be safe, not to have to fight to be safe. The room was quiet again. "And in your professional opinion," Judge Holt said, "have the trigger events occurred in this case?" Aldrich was on his feet objecting before Judge Holt had finished the sentence. The objection was sustained. The judge would make her own findings, not solicit legal conclusions from a witness. But the question had been asked, and everyone in that room had heard it, and everyone in that room knew the answer. Aldrich conducted a cross-examination that I could see, from watching his body language, he did not believe in. He asked questions about the trust's age, about whether 40-year-old documents adequately addressed contemporary circumstances, about whether Miles's long personal relationship with me compromised his professional neutrality. Miles answered each question with the patience of a man who has done this long enough to know that patience is not the same as weakness. Then it was time for closing arguments. Grant's attorney was still smooth, still polished, still architecturally competent in the way of someone who has built a career on making weak positions sound reasonable. He talked about familial concern. He talked about the subjective nature of cognitive assessment. He talked about the inherent limitations of security footage as a measure of intent. He talked about Grant's track record in business, a track record that, I noticed, he described in careful generalities without specific reference to the project at hand. He did not talk about the forged document. He did not talk about the investors. He did not talk about Thomas Garrett's testimony. He talked around the edges of the things that could not be made to sound like anything other than what they were. Miles's closing was 3 minutes long. He stood, and he said, "Eleanor Vance is 68 years old. She built and managed a significant family estate and foundation alongside her husband for decades, and she has continued to manage them with competence and care for 6 years since his death. She has her physician's assessment, her foundation's outcomes, and 31 years of friendship with a woman who looked at her that night at the inn, wet hair, numb feet, borrowed clothes, and saw not confusion or diminishment, but a woman who had just survived something terrible and was already thinking about what came next." He paused. "The person who put her in that position, who forged documents, froze accounts, dismissed staff without authority, invited a room full of investors to believe in assets he didn't own, and changed the locks on his mother's house during a 12-below blizzard. That person is not Eleanor Vance. And this court did not come here today to evaluate Eleanor Vance. It came here because someone filed a motion suggesting she should be removed from control of her own life. The evidence does not support that motion. The evidence dismantles it." He sat down. Judge Holt looked at her papers for a moment. Then she looked up. "I'm going to take a brief recess before delivering my finding," she said. 20 minutes. Man. The 20 minutes in the hallway were the longest of my life, longer than the walk through the blizzard, in a different way. The blizzard had been physical, and physical suffering has the mercy of requiring your full attention. The hallway was quiet and warm and required nothing of my body, which left my mind to do whatever it wanted with 20 minutes of waiting. Ruth sat beside me. She did not talk. She was one of the few people I had ever known who understood that the most valuable thing you can offer someone in a moment of extreme tension is your presence without demands on it. She sat beside me, and I was grateful for her in the way you are grateful for things that are real and solid when the ground feels uncertain. Miles stood a little apart, reviewing documents he had already reviewed because that was his way of managing tension, making himself useful to a process that had temporarily moved beyond his ability to influence. I thought about the night of the storm. I thought about standing on that step with the lock clicking home behind me and the cold coming through my sweater. I thought about what I had felt in that moment. Not just the physical cold, but the cold of being looked at by your own child and found to be essentially in the way. I had spent a great deal of my life, I realized, trying to not be in the way, trying to smooth and accommodate and make room for everyone else's version of how things should go. Harold had always said I was the most diplomatically competent person he knew, which was a compliment, but also, I now understood, a very gentle description of a tendency that had sometimes served me and sometimes cost me. Standing in that snow had burned something out of me that I had carried for too long. I was not sorry for what had followed. The bailiff opened the door. Miles tucked his documents away. Ruth stood. We went back in. Grant was already at his table, composed on the surface in the way of a man who has trained himself to perform composure under pressure. His lead attorney was speaking to him quietly, a hand briefly on his arm. Grant nodded once, his jaw set, and looked forward. I sat beside Miles. Judge Holt settled, arranged her papers one final time, and looked up. "In the matter of Vance's competency review," she said, "I have reviewed the evidence presented today in its entirety. The petitioner's case rests primarily on the assessment of a physician who did not examine the respondent, financial analysis that evaluated methodology without outcome, and character witness testimony mediated entirely through the petitioner's own framing. The respondent's case presents a full physician examination finding no cognitive impairment, documented evidence of financial decisions with demonstrable positive outcomes, and multiple independent witnesses with unmediated relationships attesting to the respondent's clarity and capacity." She looked down at her papers briefly, then back up. "I am denying the petition for competency review. Eleanor Vance is fully competent to manage her personal and financial affairs." I heard Ruth exhale beside me. "Furthermore," Judge Holt continued, and her voice shifted slightly, the same composure, but something underneath it that was not neutral. "I am referring the evidence presented today regarding the forged authorization document, the unauthorized account access, and the investor representations to the district attorney's office for review. I am also referring this case to the State Elder Protection Services Division." She looked at Grant's table. "The evidence in this proceeding raises serious concerns that go beyond the scope of today's hearing, and those concerns will be addressed in the appropriate venues." She looked at Miles. "Counsel, I understand you have an additional matter to present regarding the trust document." "Yes, Your Honor." Miles stood and submitted the trust document, the original notarized 40-year-old document that Harold had created with the care and intention of a man who loved his family well enough to protect them from their own worst possibilities. He directed the court's attention to Section 12, subsection 4, the Protection Clause. He read it aloud. He read it aloud, and in that wood-paneled room with the fluorescent lighting that was slightly too harsh, in front of a judge who had already decided, in front of investors who had already been deceived, in front of a gallery that had watched 4 minutes and 37 seconds of footage that showed exactly what Grant Vance had done. He read it aloud, and it was the most important thing Harold had ever said in a room he was not present in. Any designated successor who engages in exploitation, coercion, fraudulent action, or abandonment of the living trustee shall be automatically and permanently disqualified from trust succession. No further action by the trustee is required to activate this provision. The protection of the living trustee is the paramount purpose of this clause, and it shall be construed broadly in that service. Judge Holt looked at both tables. Given the evidence presented today and the unambiguous language of the trust document, this court finds that the automatic disqualification provision has been triggered. Grant Vance is removed from trust succession effective immediately. The room did not erupt. It was not that kind of room, not that kind of judge. But the silence that followed was not an ordinary silence. It was the silence of a thing that has been building for a very long time, finally, completely, stopping. I looked at my hands on the table in front of me. I thought about Harold sitting with Miles 40 years ago in this same town, writing words into a document that he hoped no one would ever need. Writing them anyway. Because he knew, as anyone who has loved people honestly eventually knows, that hope and preparation are not the same thing, and that you owe the people you love both. I thought about 14 children learning to read. I thought about a spring garden no one ever asked Dorothy about. I thought about 2 miles of snow in house shoes, and the particular cold of a door closing on you, and what it had taken, everything I had, every steadiness Harold had ever taught me, to walk away from that door without screaming. I thought about all of it. Then I looked up. Across the aisle, Grant sat very still. His attorneys were speaking to him, but he was not looking at them. He was looking at the table in front of him, and his face had the hollow, stunned quality of a man who had believed right up until this moment that he was going to win. Not because he had strong evidence or moral grounds, but because he had always won before, in all the ways that people like Grant manage to win, through confidence and presentation and the specific advantage that accrues to those who assume the world will accommodate their version of events. The world had not accommodated him. He looked up then, and for one moment, just one, and I do not know what it cost him, he looked at me directly. I did not look away. I did not smile or nod or offer him any of the things a mother might reflexively offer a child who is hurting, because the reflex that produces those things was still present in me, but the wisdom to act on it in this moment was not. What I gave him instead was simply my gaze, steady and clear and without particular warmth, but also without hatred. He was still my son. He was also someone I no longer recognized. Both of those things were true at the same time, and I was done trying to resolve the contradiction. He looked away first. Marissa was already moving in the gallery, gathering her bag, not looking at the table where her husband sat, not looking at me, looking at the door, the way people look at exits when they have already decided they are leaving, and the only question is the timing. The state attorney's observers were speaking to each other in low voices. Thomas Garrett stood and put on his coat and caught my eye across the room and gave a single brief nod that contained more human communication than some conversations I had sat through for hours. Miles put his hand briefly on my arm, not celebrating, just present. "Eleanor," he said quietly. "I know," I said. Ruth was already at the gallery railing, waiting for me to stand. Outside the courthouse windows, the late afternoon light was doing the thing Harold always noticed. Low and golden, and scattered across everything equally, the way light sometimes is in winter when it finally breaks through and finds the world still there. I gathered my things. I stood up. I walked out of that courtroom on my own 2 feet, in the suit Miles's assistant had arranged, with Ruth beside me and the sound of my own footsteps on the courthouse floor, and I thought of nothing grand or final or cinematic. I thought, I need to call Rosa and tell her I'm coming home. Rosa answered on the first ring. I was still standing on the courthouse steps, the cold finding the gaps in my suit jacket, Ruth beside me with her keys in her hand. Miles was a few steps back, giving me the small privacy of distance. "Mrs. Vance!" Rosa's voice had something in it I had not heard before. A tightness, a held quality, like someone who has been waiting for a phone to ring and is not yet sure whether to be relieved. "Rosa, I'm coming home." A silence. Then a sound I was not prepared for. Not crying exactly, something more compressed than that. The sound a person makes when they have been holding something very tightly for a very long time and have just been told they can put it down. "I'll have the house ready," she said. "You don't need to keep—" "Mrs. Vance," her voice steadied. Please let me do this. Please. I let her. Ruth drove me up the mountain road for the second time, but this time we did not stop at the bottom of the hill and look at the house from a distance. We drove all the way to the front, and Ruth pulled up on the gravel, and the headlights swept across the limestone facade the way they had 1,000 times before, and I sat in the passenger seat for a moment looking at it. The lights were on inside. Every room, it seemed, the library, the front hall, the kitchen at the back, the upstairs rooms. Rosa had gone through and turned on every light, which was not practical and was not economical and was exactly right. I got out of the car. The front door opened before I reached it, and Rosa was there, and she looked at me for one moment with an expression that contained 18 years of loyalty and the specific knowledge of someone who has watched a wrong thing happen and has waited longer than they should have had to see it corrected. Then she stepped back and held the door wide. I walked into my house. The warmth was Harold's warmth, the particular temperature and quality of air inside limestone walls with good insulation and a fireplace that Rosa had evidently lit sometime in the past hour, anticipating my arrival. The smell was right. The particular combination of old wood and the lavender Rosa kept in the linens and the faint trace of the garden that clings to a house even in winter through some alchemy I have never been able to explain. I stood in my front hall and breathed. Ruth came in behind me. She stood beside me for a moment, then said very quietly, "There it is." "Yes," I said. I walked through every room that night. Not checking, not inventorying, not looking for what Grant might have moved or taken, just walking. The library with its built-in shelves and the desk where Harold used to work late and the window that caught the morning light. The kitchen where Rosa had left soup on the stove. Again, because she knew me well enough to know what I would need. The dining room where we had held 40 years of Thanksgiving dinners and birthday celebrations and the occasional terrible argument that families have when they are close enough to wound each other. Upstairs, I stood in the doorway of the room that had been Harold's study and looked at the shelves of books and the old leather chair and the lamp with the green glass shade that he'd had since before we met and that I had always found slightly ugly and had kept anyway because it was his and because some things you keep not for their beauty but for what they carry. I sat in the leather chair. I sat there for a long time. I was not, I want to be honest with you, entirely all right. The win in the courtroom was real, and the relief was real, and the feeling of walking back through my own front door was something I will carry for the rest of my life. But the thing about surviving a betrayal of that magnitude, and I want to say this directly because I think it matters, is that surviving it does not instantly resolve it. You do not walk out of a courthouse and immediately feel like yourself again. You feel like a person who has been through something significant and is standing on the other side of it, which is a different thing. The ground is the same ground, but your relationship to it has changed, and it takes time to recalibrate. Longer than you want it to, longer than the story makes it seem. I sat in Harold's chair, and I let myself feel all of it. The exhaustion, the relief, the grief that had been waiting under the anger like water under ice, and the specific, complicated sorrow of a woman who loves her son and can no longer trust him and has no map for how to hold both of those truths without one of them destroying the other. I did not have an answer that night. I was not sure I would ever have a clean answer, but I was home. The weeks that followed were not quiet, though I had wanted quiet. The legal processes that Judge Holt had set in motion moved at the implacable pace of institutions that have their own timelines, an answer to no one's desire for resolution. The district attorney's office opened a formal investigation into the forged authorization document. Miles managed most of the communications with that office on my behalf, which I was grateful for because my energy in those weeks was finite in a way it had not been before, and I was learning to spend it carefully. Grant's development project collapsed. It did not collapse slowly or gracefully. It collapsed the way things do when the structural support is removed, quickly, completely, with a kind of cascading inevitability that was hard to watch even from the distance I was maintaining. 3 investors filed civil fraud claims within the first week after the hearing. 4 more followed within the month. The project's financing evaporated. The properties that had been under development went back into receivership. The firm Grant had built his professional identity around for 15 years was, within 6 weeks of the hearing, operating with a skeleton staff and under the cloud of multiple ongoing legal proceedings. I want to be honest about how I felt watching this. People expect, I think, a certain satisfaction from a story like mine. The wrongdoer brought down, the scales balanced, the sense of clean justice that makes the suffering retroactively meaningful. And there was some of that. I will not pretend there wasn't. There was a morning, about 3 weeks after the hearing, when Miles called to tell me that the largest investor had filed a claim that would likely result in personal liability for Grant. And I sat with my coffee and felt, briefly, the cold satisfaction of someone who has been vindicated by facts. That was real. But underneath it was something more complicated. Grief that kept arriving in unexpected moments. The particular grief of watching a life you helped build unravel. Grant was my son. I had changed his diapers and taught him to read and held him through his first heartbreak at 17 and stood beside Harold when Grant got his first real success in business. And the pride I had felt that day was as pure and uncomplicated as anything I had ever experienced. That person still existed in me. The love for that person still existed in me, even when the person himself was somewhere I could not reach. I cried exactly once during those weeks, late at night in the library with the fire going and the rest of the house quiet. I cried for about 10 minutes, and then I wiped my face and went to bed, because grief is real and it deserves acknowledgement, and it does not deserve to run the show. Marissa called me 6 weeks after the hearing. I almost didn't take the call. I stared at her name on Rosa's handset. Marissa did not have my personal cell number, had called the house line, for 3 full rings, and then I picked up because I am, at my core, someone who would rather know than not know. Eleanor. Her voice was different from every other time I had heard it, stripped of the careful warmth she performed and of the composed concern she had worn through the hearing. What was left underneath was something more ordinary and more tired. Marissa. A pause. I don't expect anything from this call, she said. I needed to say something. I knew what Grant was doing. Not everything, not all the details, but I knew the direction of it, and I didn't stop it. I told myself it was complicated, and that he was under a lot of pressure, and that... She stopped. I told myself a lot of things that let me not look directly at what was happening. I was quiet. I'm sorry, she said. I know that's not sufficient. I know there's no version of sorry that makes what happened to you, what happened that night, okay. But I needed to say it anyway. I thought about what I wanted to say back to her. I thought about it honestly, without the reflex toward either forgiveness or punishment that both felt, in this moment, like the wrong response. I believe you're sorry, I said finally. And I believe what you're describing is true. You looked away because looking directly was costly. I paused. But Marissa, you were in the gallery during that hearing. You sat in that room and you watched that footage, and you watched Miles present every document, and you were there when the judge read her finding. And afterward you left. You walked straight to the door, and you left. Oh, I kept my voice level. I don't know what happens between you and Grant going forward. That's between you, but I want you to understand that looking away from something harmful is not a neutral act. It is a choice, and it has consequences. Silence. I know, she said, very quietly. Take care of yourself, I said. I meant it, not warmly, but genuinely. That's all I have for you right now. I hung up. I sat with the phone in my lap for a moment. Rosa appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, with the timing she had that I had stopped trying to explain. She set one on the table beside me and took the other to the kitchen and left me to it. I drank my tea. Well, Grant contacted Miles 3 months after the hearing. Not me. Miles. Through his own attorney, though his team had shrunk considerably by then, from 3 attorneys at the hearing to 1, a younger man named Cooper, who struck Miles as competent and somewhat uncomfortable with the position he'd inherited. The message was formal and brief. Grant acknowledged the court's finding. He acknowledged the trust disqualification. He was prepared, his attorney wrote, to discuss restitution for the unauthorized account access and to cooperate with the district attorney's investigation on a limited basis in exchange for a reduced scope of prosecution. Miles called me to discuss it. We sat in his conference room, same table, the same faint smell of old paper and wood polish that I had come to associate with the months of my life that had changed most fundamentally. And Miles walked me through what cooperation meant legally and what restitution would cover and what the district attorney's office was likely to accept. "What do you want, Eleanor?" Miles asked when he had finished the mechanics. "Not what's optimal legally. What do you actually want?" I looked at the table. "I want the foundation accounts fully restored," I said, "with interest. Every dollar that was inaccessible during those weeks cost the foundation in ways that can be calculated and some ways that can't. I want the staff made whole. Philip's dismissal, any lost wages from that period, compensated. Rosa and Thomas and the others who were threatened by those letters, I wanted acknowledged in writing what was done and that they were right to disregard it." I paused. "And I want Grant to cooperate fully with the DA, not selectively, fully." Miles nodded. He was writing. "And in exchange, I will not file a separate civil action against him. The investors have their own claims, and I will not interfere with those. They have every right to pursue them, and I hope they do. But I will not add my own action on top of everything else." I looked at Miles. "Not because I'm forgiving him, because I have decided that spending more of my life in a courtroom arguing about my son is not how I intend to use what comes next." Miles looked at me steadily. "That's generous, Eleanor." "It's practical," I said. "There's a difference." The negotiation took 2 weeks. Cooper was efficient, and Grant, to his credit, and I grant him this credit with full awareness that it is a low bar, did not negotiate in bad faith. The restitution agreement was signed. The foundation accounts were restored in full. Philip received a formal letter of acknowledgement and compensation that made him call me, briefly, to say thank you in the specific way of a man who is not comfortable with sentiment and gets through it quickly. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The letter." 22 years, Philip, I said. 22 years of work on those grounds. "Of course I did." He cleared his throat. "When are you reopening the rose beds?" "Spring," I said. "I was hoping you'd come back." A pause. "Well," he said, "I suppose someone has to." The district attorney's investigation concluded 4 months later. Grant pled guilty to 1 count of financial fraud and 1 count of elder financial exploitation. He received a suspended sentence with 2 years of probation and a structured repayment plan to the investors who had filed civil claims. He did not serve jail time. I want to tell you how I feel about that, because I think it matters, and I think you deserve my honest accounting of it. I am not satisfied with it. I want to be clear about that. A suspended sentence for what my son did, for the forged documents, the stolen access, the investor fraud, for leaving his 68-year-old mother in the snow in 12 below zero, does not feel like proportional justice. If you told me you felt angry hearing that, I would understand completely. I felt angry too, but I've also lived long enough to know that the justice system is a human institution, which means it is imperfect and inconsistent and sometimes responds to circumstances in ways that feel inadequate, and that my peace cannot depend on its adequacy. My peace has to come from somewhere more durable than a sentencing outcome. What I held on to was this. It was on the record. Everything Grant had done was documented, admitted, and entered into the permanent record of a legal proceeding. He could not rewrite it. He could not manage it away or charm it into a better narrative, or find a smoother version of events that left him looking only slightly imprudent rather than deliberately exploitative. It was there. It would always be there. And in the world Grant inhabited, the world of investors and business relationships and professional reputation, that record was its own form of consequence that the sentencing document didn't fully capture. His investors knew. His colleagues knew. His professional network, built over 20 years, had been given specific and documented reason to reassess everything they thought they knew about him. That was not nothing. That was in some ways the thing he had feared most, more than legal consequences, more than financial losses, the loss of the story he had told about himself. I thought about that sometimes, about how much of what Grant had done had been driven by the desperate need to maintain a particular story about himself: the successful son, the competent heir, the man who managed things rather than the man who had failed and needed help. He had burned everything that mattered to protect a story. And the story had burned anyway. I hoped he would learn something from that. I did not know if he would. There is one more thing I need to tell you, and it is the thing that matters most. And it happened on a Tuesday in March, about 5 months after the hearing, when the snow had finally retreated from everywhere but the highest ridge, and the garden was showing the first cautious green at the edges. I had been working, in the months since coming home, on something that had started forming the afternoon I sat with Dorothy at Ruth's kitchen table and listened to her talk about a spring garden nobody ever asked about. Something that had clarified slowly, the way things do when they are growing rather than being constructed. The idea was simple. The Vance estate had 12 bedrooms, 7 of which had been unused for years. It had a professional kitchen, a large common room, grounds that Philip was methodically returning to their best version, and more infrastructure than one 68-year-old woman needed for her personal use. The family foundation had resources, relationships, and 4 decades of operational experience in serving communities that had been overlooked. I brought the idea to the foundation board in February. To Miles, who had strong feelings about making sure the legal structure was correctly configured. To Rosa, who had opinions about the kitchen logistics that were both extensive and correct. To Philip, who looked at the grounds plan I showed him and said, "You'll want another person for the gardens. You can't do a kitchen garden of that scale with just me." And then agreed, before I could respond, to help find that person. I brought it to Ruth last because Ruth had been present at the beginning of it, that afternoon with Dorothy and the grocery bags, even if she didn't know it. We were sitting on her porch in late February, bundled in coats, with the mountain visible and the road below going about its ordinary business, and I described what I was planning: the winter refuge, emergency short-term housing, and support for seniors who found themselves without a safe place due to family circumstances, health crises, housing loss. A place that was not a facility, not a managed environment with protocols and intake forms and the clinical smell of institutional care. A house, a home, with a real kitchen and a library and guest rooms that had been filled with Harold's particular taste and that held, in their walls and their proportions and their light, the specific warmth of a life lived there with intention. A place where no one would be left in the cold. Ruth listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she looked out at the road for a moment. "Dorothy's been having a hard winter," she said. "I know. She'd never ask for help." "I know that too." Ruth looked at me. "You're going to have to find a way to make it feel like something other than charity. People our age—" She stopped, amended. "People who've been independent their whole lives don't take easily to being helped." "I know," I said. "I'm thinking about that. And Eleanor," she paused, "you're going to need to be careful about what this costs you, personally. You've just been through—" "I know what I've been through," I said, gently but firmly. "And I know what it showed me, about what it feels like to be alone and without resources in a crisis, and to have a door close on you that should have stayed open. I know what that is now, in my body, not as an abstraction." I looked at the mountain. I would rather use that knowledge for something than spend the rest of my life just recovering from it. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll help." The Vance Mountain House opened on the first Saturday of November. We had spent 8 months preparing: the renovations, the legal structure under the foundation's umbrella, the staff hiring which Rosa oversaw with the thoroughness she applied to everything, the partnership agreements with 3 local social service organizations who would make referrals and provide coordination support. Philip had the gardens in better shape than they had been in 10 years. He had also, with very little fanfare, hired a part-time groundskeeper named Elena, who was 26 and enthusiastic about heirloom vegetables in a way that made Philip slightly suspicious, and also, I noticed, noticeably more willing to spend time in the kitchen garden. Miles had been rigorous about the foundation structure. The estate remained mine, all of it, fully under my authority and the trust's protection. The Mountain House was a program of the foundation, properly constituted with its own governance and oversight. I will not have you open yourself to any ambiguity about personal versus institutional assets, Miles had said, with the firmness of a man who had spent the last year watching ambiguity be weaponized. Everything clean, everything documented. Dorothy was the third resident we welcomed. She had not come to us through a formal referral. She had come because Ruth had mentioned it to her in March, and then again in June, and then in September had driven her up the mountain road to see the house while work was still in progress. Dorothy had stood in the front hall and looked at the limestone walls and the high ceilings and the morning light coming through the tall windows and said, with characteristic restraint, "This is a very good house." Yes. She moved in 2 weeks before opening with 3 boxes, a small collection of seed packets she had been saving, and the plan for a spring garden that she had been developing in detail since the previous winter. The first night she was there, I found her sitting at the kitchen table after dinner with the seed packet spread out in front of her, making a list in a small notebook. I sat down across from her with my tea. "What are you planning?" I asked. She looked up. Something in her face that evening was different from the first time I had seen her. At Ruth's Inn, hunched over grocery bags, managing alone in the specific quiet endurance of someone who has learned not to ask for too much. She was still herself. Still small and deliberate and not given to unnecessary words. But the held quality was gone. She was not managing, she was planning. "Tomatoes," she said, 6 varieties, and sweet peas along the south fence because nobody ever plants sweet peas anymore, and they should." She paused. "Philip says I can have the corner bed. He was resistant at first, but he came around." "He does that," I said. She nodded, wrote something in her notebook. "You have a good kitchen garden opportunity here," she said. "The slope faces well, the soil is going to need work, but it's workable." She looked at me directly. "I can help with that, if you'll let me." "Dorothy," I said, "that is exactly what I was hoping you'd say." Chucked. Opening night arrived cold and clear, the way November evenings in the mountains tend to, with stars that come out early and the particular quality of dark that belongs to places far enough from city lights that the sky actually means something. We had a small gathering, staff, foundation board members, a few of the partner organizations, Ruth and Thomas, who had both been present for enough of the story to deserve to be present for this. Miles came, in a good coat, looking slightly less like a man who spent all his time in conference rooms. Dr. Cho came, because she had been part of the process and had cared enough to want to see the outcome. Philip stood near the garden with a cup of something hot, watching the evening with the expression of a man surveying territory he has invested himself in. The 3 current residents moved around the gathering with varying degrees of comfort. Dorothy had stationed herself near the seed catalog display Rosa had put out on the library table and was having a conversation with the Foundation's agricultural consultant that appeared to involve strong opinions about drainage. I stood near the front window, looking out at the mountain and then back at the room, at the people moving through it, at the lights that were on in every room the same way Rosa had lit them the night I came home, at the library shelves visible through the open door and the fire going in the main room and the limestone walls holding the warmth the way they always had. Harold's house. My house. Something else now, in addition to all the things it already was. Ruth found me near the window at some point in the evening with 2 glasses of cider, handed me one, and stood beside me looking at the room. "How does it feel?" she asked. I thought about it honestly, the way Ruth always expected honesty. "Strange," I said. "Good strange. Like wearing shoes that finally fit after a long time." I looked at the room. "And strange because Harold would have loved this, and he's not here to see it." "He'd have opinions about the furniture arrangement in the common room," Ruth said. "He absolutely would have." "The desk is in the wrong corner." "It's not." "Harold would say it is." I laughed. It came out real and a little rough and surprised me slightly, the way laughter does when you haven't expected it. Ruth smiled beside me, and we stood there for a moment just looking at the room and the people in it. Then she said quietly, "Eleanor, what about Grant?" I had known she was going to ask. She was Ruth. She asked the direct question other people circled. I looked at my cider. "I don't know," I said honestly. "That's the truest answer I have. He's in his apartment in the city, as far as I know, dealing with the consequences, the probation, the civil suits." I paused. "He called Miles last month, not about legal business, just Called. Miles said he didn't say much, just asked how things were going. With the estate? With me. I felt the particular weight of that. A 40-year-old man calling his mother's attorney to ask how she was doing because he was not yet sure if he had the right to ask her directly. Miles told him I was well. Ruth was quiet. "Do you think you'll talk to him?" she asked. "Someday," I said. "Not soon. Someday." I looked at the mountain through the window. He would have to do a great deal of work before I could trust him in a room again. And not work to impress me or to regain access to something. Actual work. The kind that changes a person. I don't know if he's capable of it. I paused. I don't know that he isn't. You're leaving a door open. A very small one, I said, from a very safe distance. Ruth considered this, then nodded. I looked back at the room, at Dorothy and her seed catalogs, at Philip and his cider, at Rosa moving through the gathering with the efficiency and warmth of someone entirely in her element, at Miles in conversation with two of the Foundation board members, at the fire and the walls and the light. I thought about what I had learned in the past year. Not the strategic lessons, the legal knowledge, the understanding of what documents to keep and who to call, and what clauses to protect yourself with, though those things matter, and I would tell any woman my age to know them. I mean the other kind of learning, the kind that happens in your body rather than your mind. I learned that age is not the same as diminishment, that the accumulation of years adds things, depth, endurance, the specific clarity that comes from having survived enough to know what actually matters, that cannot be reduced to a line on a cognitive assessment or a category on an insurance form. That 68 is not the beginning of the end. It is, if you are paying attention, the beginning of something else. I learned that love and exploitation can come from the same person at the same time, and that understanding this does not require you to accept the exploitation or to stop feeling the love, but that you must be honest about both or neither one is real. I learned that the people who are not related to you by blood can protect you in ways that family sometimes can't or won't. That Ruth and Rosa and Philip and Miles and Thomas Garrett, none of whom had any obligation to do what they did, had collectively built a floor under me at the exact moment I needed one. That kindness in a crisis is not a small thing. It is the thing. I learned that protecting yourself from people who want to take what is yours is not selfishness. It is sanity. And that the dignity of knowing your own worth, the right to say this is mine, I built it, and you will not take it, does not diminish with age. If anything, it gets clearer. The older I got, the less willing I was to pretend that dignity was optional. And I learned this, which is the thing I most want to say to anyone listening who recognizes any part of this story. The voice that tells you to be quiet, to be smaller, to not make things difficult, to accept what is being done to you, because making noise will be embarrassing or costly or uncomfortable for people who have already decided to treat you as a problem. That voice is not wisdom. That voice is fear dressed up as reasonableness, and it will cost you everything if you let it. I did not scream on that step in the snow, but I did not stay silent either. I walked to Ruth's inn. I called Miles. I sat in a courtroom and let 13 people tell the truth about what my son had done. I walked back into my own house on my own 2 feet, and I turned it into something that mattered. That is what fighting looks like when you are 68 years old and have spent a lifetime being told that dignity is for other people. It does not always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like walking through the snow in your house shoes with one secret still intact and the absolute, unshakable knowledge that you are not finished. Later that evening, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet and the fire had burned down to a steady, patient glow, I turned off most of the lights and stood for a while in the library, Harold's desk, the shelves he had chosen, the window he had loved, the particular silence of a house that is full in the ways that matter. I thought about the 41 years I had lived inside these walls, the grief and the love and the ordinary Tuesdays and the extraordinary crises and the specific, irreplaceable texture of a life built in one place with intention and care. I thought about what it had cost to almost lose it, what it had cost to get it back. I looked at Harold's chair, the leather chair upstairs that I had sat in the night I came home, and I thought about the man who had sat in it before me, reviewing documents he hoped no one would ever need. writing protection into the structure of things because he understood that love, on its own, is not always enough. That sometimes love has to be built into the paperwork. I got it back, I said, to the empty room. To Harold, or to no one, or to both. I'm still here. The fire settled. The house held its warmth. Outside, the mountain stood against the dark the way it had stood for longer than any of us had been here or would be here, patient and indifferent and present. I turned off the last lamp. I went to bed in my own house. And I slept. For the first time in months, fully, without the half-wakefulness of a person whose body has not yet accepted that the danger has passed. I slept like someone who has come home. Because I had.